I woke up on that train with my cheek pressed to a hard seat and the taste of metal on my tongue. And at 9 years old, I learned the shape of being alone. For as long as I live, I will never forget the way the carriage rocked me like a cradle, and the world outside blurred past in strips of green and gray. I opened my eyes thinking of my mother, the way she tied my braid crooked when she was in a hurry, the smell of coffee she always left on the counter, the little hum she made when she folded the laundry, and for a long moment I felt safe. Then the empty seat beside me told me otherwise. I had clutched my doll so tight I thought I might lose feeling in my fingers. The doll's face was smeared with dust and a line of dried jam. I remember thinking how ridiculous it was that even my doll looked abandoned. I called for her once loud and sharp and childish, and no one answered. I walked down the aisle with my bare knees knocking against the seats. And each time I turned a corridor, I expected to find her returning with that calm, tired smile. There was no sign. Only the rain on the window and the polite clink of cups as strangers sipped their tea. They tell you, when you are small, that people you love will always be there. They tell you 100 times over. But nobody tells you what it feels like when the promise breaks. Nobody tells you how the absence settles like an ache in your chest and how the world turns into a place with sharper corners. The conductor asked my name and I told him. He wrote it down in a little book with a pencil that smelled like wood. He was kind in the way that people are kind when they don't have a name for the kind of loss sitting in front of them. He took my hand and promised I would be looked after. I believed him because I had nothing else to believe. I grew up in other houses after that, rooms that were neat but unfamiliar. Other women with kinder hands who fed me and tucked me in and said, "You're safe now." I learned to be polite too. Strangers, and to make my bed straight without thinking. I learned to say thank you, but at night, when the heater clicked off and the hallway got the gray color of memories, I would press my forehead to the cold window and think, always, of the person who walked away. Where had she gone? Why hadn't she come back? Those questions turned round and round in my head like a little wheel. In the beginning, I called it abandonment. I called it every hard word I could find, and I wrapped myself in those words like a cloak because they kept me warm in the winter. I grew up thinking she had simply left, that she had chosen a life that didn't include me. I held on to my resentment like a talisman. It was easier to be angry than to be hollow. Anger teaches you how to stand and gives direction to trembling legs. For years I honed that anger. It kept people at a distance and kept me safe. School was a series of careful negotiations. Children stare at the edges of the fence where other children play with their mothers. They don't always mean to be cruel, but they can be. I learned to fold myself small in the face of those glances. I learned to be independent because independence is what you have when love seems optional. Later, when I became a mother myself, I wore my resentment like armor. Each time my daughter clung to me after a nightmare, I answered because I couldn't bear for her to feel the emptiness I had felt. I promised I would never teach her to make room for rage the way I had been taught. I built a life on small things, a steady job, a home with a porch swing, a rooster of sunflowers by the fence. I loved quietly and fiercely. My husband and I held the house together with the cement of being ordinary. We raised our child with the kind of measured affection that felt safer than the more theatrical displays I had seen in other families. For a while, that felt enough. I told myself the story of what had happened when I was 9 in a very simple sentence. My mother had left. It was tidy and crisp and helped me sleep. Years passed. The story did what stories do. It hardened. It became part of my bones. Whenever my daughter asked about her grandmother, and sometimes she didn't ask, because children have a way of not wanting to dig at old wounds, I told her little things that fit the story. She had to go, I would say, as if I were closing a door and the loud click meant the end of it. I thought that the certainty would protect me and shield my child from the jagged edges of not having answers. There are moments in life when a single detail overturns the whole table. For me, it came like a letter sliding under a door years later, when I had already grown into the woman I thought I would be. I had made a life from wood and bread and stubbornness, and I had believed that my past had been set in stone. Then a thin envelope arrived with handwriting that shook like it knew how to keep itself small. The stamp was old. The ink smelled faintly of someone who had kept too many secrets. I wouldn't open it right away. I held it for a little while, just the weight of the paper in my hands. There is something about papers from the past. They make you feel as though you could somehow touch the person who put them there. When I finally opened the letter, it felt as though the air changed. The script inside was careful and clear. But the words were the kind that push you into motion. You were left on the train for safety. It said, "Believe me, I had no choice." That single clause, "for safety," turned my stomach in a way that no accusation ever had. I had, for so long, kept a neat, clean rage about the woman who left. Rage is a tidy companion. But the words "no choice" opened a crack. It meant that perhaps there had been a hand that pushed her away even as her heart wanted to stay. I had to know more. I went to the records, awkward and nervous as someone who has been taught every kind of modesty about nosing into things. I asked questions at old stations, rummaged through the catalog of time when people were still alive, who remembered the train lines and the routes in the little pockets of the city where a child could vanish into someone else's plan. Sometimes people are kinder than you expect. An old clerk at a station, hair thin as cobwebs, told me in a voice like gravel that there had been raids in those years, that police moved pockets of people away from danger without much ceremony. Another woman, a long-retired nurse, handed me a paper photocopy of a form that mentioned a child placed for safety and then moved when the need was over. The words were dry, but they pulled the same thread I had felt in my hands, a thread of a decision made by people with no way to write the kind of story a single mother wants to tell her child. I don't know why. For so long, I wrapped myself in the story of being abandoned. It was simpler to be the wronged one. It allowed me to erect boundaries around my heart, neat palisades that said, "Do not mess with me." But the truth, when it came in a rush that left no space for neatness. Piece by piece, a photograph slipped into an envelope, a name, a date, an old address, a narrative formed that looked nothing like the cold picture I had kept in my mind. The photograph was the hardest. I found it in the folder at the bottom of a chest, corners brittle with time. A woman sat in the photograph. A young woman with a face like a pressed flower and sorrow in her eyes. She was younger than I had imagined my mother would be. Her hair was done in a style that belonged to an era when people still ironed their collars. She carried a child, me as a small, solemn person clutching a rag doll. There was a line written on the back, "Left for safety, not for want." That line, those 3 words, cut into me like a blade and softened at the same time. I cried long and hard into my hands, like I had never cried for anything else. You would think the discovery would bring only relief, clarifying things, putting a name to the ache, but it is never that simple. Instead, I felt a whole catalog of lost things surge up like a tide. Years of anger unspooled into questions, and questions turned into anger again. For why I had been kept in the dark, why a choice that might have saved us had been hidden and turned into abandonment. By the silence around it, who had decided for us? Who had the right? The world swelled around me with people who had opinions and not necessarily kindness, and I found myself playing a kind of tug-of-war with my own memories. For months, I pieced together fragments. A neighbor who had seen my mother speaking in hurried tones to the story that emerged was not of a woman who loved me less than she could or would. It was of a small household being hunted by forces larger than their door. There were men who moved through offices and rooms in ways that made decisions like sheep being directed into barns. They took people and moved them according to laws nobody taught us in school, but which bent the lives of ordinary folks with distressing ease. And then there was the part that made my blood run cold. My mother had been promised she would be able to take me back when it was safe. She had been promised she would be given the chance to come for me when the storm had passed. But somewhere between the promise and the possible, something went wrong. Promises, it turns out, are made by humans in the same shaky handwriting that keeps bail across the years. When the truth finally came into sharp focus, it did not arrive as a heroic scene of reunion. It arrived as a slow, bureaucratic failing, lost forms, misread names. People moved from place to place in a way that meant a child could be folded into someone else's life like a letter into an envelope and never made whole again. The agency that had arranged the move had, in the end, not made the calls that would bring mother and child back together. Names were misspelled. A woman who meant to return to a station was sent miles away. The years of grief that followed were not a simple tale of choice so much as the heartbreaking landscape of things that happen when systems fail the most fragile among us.com. Imagine carrying a bitterness for decades, and then realizing that the thing you held on to survive was built on a misunderstanding. For some people, that realization would be relief. For me, it became a complicated mix of guilt, sorrow, and a strange tenderness toward someone I had labeled with the worst of words for so long. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, the light from the window slowing over the cup of tea I was holding, and feeling the world tilt once more. I began to think of my mother not as the woman who left, but as the woman who had tried, in the only ways she could, to protect us both. And once I allowed that thought to live in me, once I let it breathe, something inside me that had been hard as stone began to fracture into smaller, more honest pieces. There was no dramatic reunion. Life does not tidy itself that way. Instead, there were phone calls halting, thick with years and the quiet unpeeling of defenses. I found names and addresses, and then a voice that carried the accent of the place she had been kept. The first time I heard my mother's voice, she told me how she had been pushed into a corner and handed a choice between staying with me or being dragged into something worse. And in the heat of the moment had done what she could to keep me alive. Her words were clumsy with apology because time takes practice. And we had no manual for the way our lives would splinter. Forgiveness is not a single moment. It is more like a river, widening with each gentle current. I had to let the water run through me slowly. My anger had been a useful thing. It had kept me upright and had given me a language for survival. But when I finally began to speak to the woman who had once stooped to tie my shoes, I found that my chest could hold tenderness and fury at the same time. We had been two women carrying the same grief in different ways. She had been carved by fear. I had been carved by resentment. In the middle, between the two of us, stood the child who had slept on a train bench and the woman I had become. It took work to unlearn the harsh phrases I had used to justify my distance. I had to tell myself, often and aloud, that people make the choices their times afford them. I had to accept that some hands are forced in a way that leaves you with no script but a trash bag of improvisations. We arranged meetings at first in neutral places where our voices felt safe. We walked in a park with the smell of clover and exhaust, and I listened to her tell me the names of towns I had only read once on a map. She spoke of a man who had helped her out of trouble once and of promises that had been spoken the way people speak to comfort themselves. Not knowing how brittle those promises will be when the wind comes, I thought often about that night who had curled herself into the corner of a train and decided that abandonment was the only story. I wanted to go back and tell her the truth, the one I had only just learned. I wanted to say, you were always loved by someone, even if she had to do something that seemed impossible. But you cannot tell a child of 9 the language of government and shadow. You have to honor the small person she became and also tell the truth as carefully as a woman stitches a hem. In the months that followed my discovery, I made space for both our pasts. There were days that felt like little resurrections. My mother and I would sit for tea and exchange recipes. A small, stubborn old woman thing that made us both laugh. She showed me the way she had folded clothes to save on space. The way she had hummed lullabies in the dark, so I might sleep while she listened for boots in the distance. We traded silence for stories and stories for a new kind of tether that was messy and real. Now, when the sun hits my kitchen table in a certain way, I think of that 9-year-old and I say a small prayer for her. That she was brave, that she survived, that she learned how to build tenderness out of the rubble. I tell my daughter that history is not a single story but a knotted skein. We take the knot apart together, slowly. And then we knit something new, sometimes ugly, sometimes garish, sometimes wonderfully warm. We do not pretend the past did not hurt. We honor it. And then we put it on the shelf with other pieces that remember us and keep living. When I close my eyes now, the train is a place of motion and not of terror. I imagine my small hand held by a woman who had been forced to choose between dangers, and the only way she knew to protect me. That image does not erase the years I spent angry. It does not melt every ache, but it lets me sleep at night without clutching a grudge like an old coin. It lets me look back and see not only what was lost but also what was saved. It lets me speak my truth without swallowing the whole of it. I tell you this because I think forgiveness is one of the most radical things we can do. Not because it makes the world gentle, it rarely does, but because it frees us. It lets us step out of the heavy cloak of bitterness and say, I will not be owned by my past. And if that seems small, then think about how often small things become everything. I am an old woman now with hands that tremble and a memory that sometimes forgets names. But I remember this. I was left on a train and then given more truth than I could have expected. I was angry, then I was curious, then I was whole again in small increments. I grew up hating a story, and then I learned the truth. The truth did not undo the harm, but it taught me how to carry it without letting it define the rest of my days. If you are listening to this and you carry a similar ache, take it slow. Gather your papers, ask the blunt questions. Find the small people who keep things in their pockets and ship them to you like lifelines. Hold your anger tenderly and then put it down when you must. Live your life, and when you can, let the small kindnesses back in. They will not reverse all the years that were lost, but they will make the next years easier to wear. Of course, there were complications. Finding out the truth did not erase a childhood of feeling unmoored. Old hatreds do not simply evaporate because the paperwork was wrong or because a man with a badge made a decision. There were relatives who could not understand why I would choose to reconcile. There were people who said I had been foolish to soften my heart. Sometimes I would walk away from a window where a neighbor watched and think about the cost of letting go. It has a price. Forgiveness requires a kind of courage that looks a lot like weakness until you have watched it work on someone's bones. In the end, what I learned was not so much a triumphant moral but a quiet one. Life keeps making us practice the act of deciding what we will do with our knowledge. Knowledge can save you or it can drown you. It all depends on whether you let it make you cruel. For years, I had been cruel to myself and to the idea of my mother because of a narrative that made me feel safe. When the truth came, I had to rearrange my life around it. I had to let the tenderness in where the judgment had been. I had to teach my daughter how to be kinder, not because the truth made things easy, but because softness was more honest than wrath. We grew old together in fits and starts. We walked to the park and argued about which bakery had the best rolls. We sat on the porch in the afternoons and watched neighborhood children ride bikes and get scraped knees. Sometimes I would see her in the way she smoothed my hair from my brow, and a small, unhinged gratitude would come over me like a wave. Once, when I was thin with worry and my knees protested every step, she came by with a thermos of stew and told me in a hurried voice that she had always watched me from afar. "I chose to keep you safe," she said, and in her voice I heard every terrible, noble thing love is capable of. Our reconciliation did not wipe clean the years of waiting. I still woke in the night sometimes and felt that old hollowness, but it softened into memory the way old wounds flatten and scar. I had a story I could finally tell without it folding me in half. It was not the tidy tale of abandonment and villainy I had told myself. Rather, it was a testament to the strange ways people try to protect the ones they love, sometimes making choices that end up wounding the very people they hoped to save. If there is any lesson I would give to the woman out there who sits with a small, hot resentment about someone who left, who walked, who disappeared, it is this: look for the thread beneath the anger. Ask who else was moving in the night. Ask what forces, what desperate hands, decided how your life would be folded. Rage can keep you alive. So can compassion when you have the courage to let it in. Both can exist together, like two forces pushing at the same door.